surrounded. When we talk about learning how to pray, the most important place to begin, before technique, before timing, rounded, before structure, is understanding what prayer truly is. If you misunderstand the nature of prayer, rounded, then everything that follows will be shallow at best, performative at worst. A rounded prayer is not a formula to manipulate divine outcomes, surrounded, and it is certainly not a religious chore that earns you spiritual points. It is, at its core, surrounded, a conscious act of connecting with God, of aligning the soul with something infinitely greater than itself, surrounded. And that connection is not built on performance or perfection, it's built on presence. You see, surrounded, psychologically speaking, we are wired for connection. We seek meaning, we seek understanding, we seek to be known. Surrounded, that longing isn't just emotional, it's neurological. Prayer, when rightly understood, rounded, is the act of bringing our deepest self into a state of communion with the ultimate reality, what theistic traditions call God, rounded. And that communion does not require you to fake strength or mask your flaws. In fact, it demands the opposite, rounded. It invites you to bring your fragmented, anxious, confused, and even cynical self into a sacred space of honesty, surrounded. That is where transformation begins. Philosophically, prayer touches the core of human identity. Think of it, rounded. What other act so uniquely combines vulnerability, intention, and transcendence? In prayer, rounded, you are not just speaking, you are offering. You are offering your awareness, your attention, your trust, rounded, whether whispered in silence or spoken aloud in desperation, rounded. Prayer is the act of lifting your internal world, your thoughts, desires, fears, surrounded and questions into the presence of the divine. And that act alone carries immense significance, surrounded even before any answer is given. Surrounded. Many people avoid prayer because they believe they're not spiritual enough, or that their minds wander too much, surrounded, or that they don't know what to say. But that misses the point entirely. Surrounded. Prayer is not about achieving a mystical state. It's about showing up, rounded. It's about choosing to be real in a moment that invites transcendence. It's about becoming more human, not less, rounded. You don't have to be articulate, you have to be authentic, rounded. One of the most destructive myths about prayer is that it's only meant for times of crisis, surrounded. That prayer is a last resort when all else fails. But if that's the only context in which we pray, surrounded, then we've misunderstood its purpose. Prayer is not merely about outcomes, it's about orientation. Surrounded, it's not about changing God's mind, it's about realigning your own. Think of it like recalibrating a compass, rounded. The compass may have been thrown off by distraction, ego, fear, or pain. But prayer brings it back to true north, rounded, not by force, but by focus. And let's not ignore the psychological power of this realignment, surrounded. Modern cognitive science tells us that repeated attention to something greater than oneself, especially when paired with gratitude, rounded, self-reflection and openness, leads to increased emotional resilience, lower anxiety, and greater clarity. Surrounded. In other words, prayer, rightly practiced, changes the way you experience the world. It's not magic, surrounded. It's formation. The more you pray, the more you become aware, not just of God, surrounded, but of who you truly are when everything else fades into silence. So if you're asking, rounded, what is prayer? Here's the answer. Simple but not shallow prayer is a practice of presence, surrounded. It's the decision to stop running, stop pretending, and start listening. It's where theology meets intimacy, rounded, and where philosophy meets surrender. You don't need to be perfect to start. You just need to be present, surrounded. And that's where I want to leave you for now. With this thought, prayer doesn't begin when you speak, surrounded. It begins when you become aware that you're not alone. If prayer is, at its core, surrounded, a practice of presence, then the next question becomes, whose presence are you entering? Rounded. This is not a small question. In fact, it's one of the most important questions you can ask, surrounded, because how you perceive the one you're speaking to will shape everything about how you pray. Your tone, surrounded, your vulnerability, your expectations, these are all directly influenced by your image of God, surrounded. So let's pause here and ask honestly when you pray, who are you actually talking to? Many people, surrounded, whether consciously or not, approach God like a cosmic vending machine. You put in the right input, good behavior, surrounded, the right words, maybe even a bit of desperation, and you hope to get something out. If it doesn't work, surrounded, you either double down or walk away. But that model turns prayer into a transaction, not a relationship, rounded. And relationships don't thrive on performance, they thrive on presence, mutuality, and trust. Psychologically speaking, rounded, our view of God is often a reflection, sometimes a distorted one, of early authority figures in our lives, surrounded. If you were raised in an environment where love was conditional, where mistakes were punished harshly, rounded, or where vulnerability wasn't safe, chances are that image will bleed into your understanding of God, rounded. You may think you need to be good enough for God to listen, surrounded. Or you might avoid prayer altogether because you expect judgment, silence, or rejection, rounded. This isn't just a spiritual block, it's a psychological one. And if we don't name it rounded, we stay stuck in cycles of avoidance or anxiety when it comes to prayer. But what if God isn't like that at all? Rounded. Throughout history, the greatest minds, Augustine, Teresa of Avila, Kierkegaard, surrounded, even modern theologians like Tillich and Moltmann, have pointed us toward a vision of God, not as an abstract force, rounded, but as a personal relational being, not distant, but near, not passive, but attentive, not indifferent, rounded, but deeply invested in the human story. In this view, surrounded, God is not just the creator of the universe, He is the sustainer of your breath. He is not merely omnipotent, rounded. He is also intimately compassionate. Think about the psychological weight of that, surrounded. If you really believed that the one you're speaking to is already aware of your deepest fears, surrounded, already present in your worst moments, already loving you without condition, how would that change the way you pray? Surrounded. Would you still feel the need to perform, or would you finally feel the freedom to be honest? Surrounded. Prayer is not about convincing a reluctant deity to care, rounded. It's about entering into the presence of the one who already does. And not just in a general, rounded, but personally, uniquely, right where you are, rounded. When you grasp that, even a little, it changes everything. Surrounded. Prayer becomes less of a spiritual duty and more of a soul's return home. Philosophically, surrounded. This is one of the most radical claims in the theistic tradition, that God is not merely the ground of being, rounded, but also the hearer of prayer. The infinite is not only aware of the finite, it desires relationship with it, rounded, and not because God needs anything from you, but because love, by nature, seeks connection. Prayer then, surrounded, becomes a response to that love, not a monologue, but a dialogue, not a cry into the void, rounded, but a conversation with the source. So I'll ask you again, who are you praying to? Surrounded. Because if your answer is some version of a cold, distant, disinterested figure, surrounded, You will either stop praying altogether or pray out of fear. But if your answer is a God who sees, who listens, surrounded, who welcomes, then prayer becomes not a struggle, but a sanctuary. Here's the takeaway I want to leave with you. Surrounded. Prayer transforms when you stop speaking to God as an idea and start speaking with God as a person. Surrounded. So once you begin to grasp what prayer actually is, a conscious act of presence, and once you begin to shift your perception of who you're praying to, not an abstract force or a transactional deity, surrounded, but a personal and attentive God, then the next natural question is, how do I do it? In other words, surrounded, how does prayer actually work in practice? How do I start? What do I say? Rounded, and perhaps most honestly, is there a right way to pray? This is where structure becomes not restrictive, rounded, but freeing, because without some kind of framework, prayer can feel like emotional free fall. You sit down, surrounded, you close your eyes and suddenly your mind is everywhere. Thinking about dinner, a conversation from yesterday, surrounded, the email you forgot to send, and before you know it, you've either drifted off or shut down, surrounded. That doesn't make you undisciplined or unspiritual. It makes you human, surrounded. And that's why a simple structure can be a powerful tool. Surrounded. One of the most enduring frameworks for prayer is known by the acronym ACDS: adoration, confession, thanksgiving, surrounded. Supplication, it's not a rigid formula. It's a relational flow. It mirrors the way real, surrounded, intimate conversations unfold with reverence, with honesty, with gratitude, and with request. Rounded. Let's unpack it briefly. Adoration is not about flattering God. It's about recentering your soul. Surrounded. When you begin prayer with adoration, you're not telling God something He doesn't know. Rounded. You're reminding yourself of who He is. Psychologically, this is a grounding practice. Rounded. When you begin with reverence, your brain shifts away from self-preoccupation and toward transcendence. Surrounded. You widen the lens. You acknowledge the reality that you're not the center of the universe. And in doing so, surrounded, you find freedom. Next comes confession. This is not about shame. It's about alignment. Rounded. To confess is to be honest with yourself and with God. It's an act of intellectual integrity. Rounded. You're naming what's out of sync, what's broken, what needs repair. And the paradox is that in doing so, surrounded, you actually create space for healing. There's a deep psychological relief that comes with confession. Surrounded, it removes the weight of pretending and invites the possibility of renewal. Then there's thanksgiving. Surrounded. This is not just a polite thank you tacked onto the end of a prayer. Gratitude is a recalibration of awareness. Surrounded. Philosophers like Cicero called it the parent of all virtues, and modern psychology has shown us why. Surrounded. Gratitude literally rewires the brain. It counteracts anxiety, reorients your mood. Rounded, and enhances your capacity for joy. When you practice thanksgiving in prayer, rounded, you begin to see that even in the midst of difficulty, there are signs of grace. And finally, supplication, surrounded. This is where you make your requests known, but notice it comes last. Rounded. Not because God needs to be buttered up first, but because the order changes your posture. After adoring, confessing, surrounded, and giving thanks, you're no longer asking out of panic or entitlement. Surrounded. You're asking from a place of trust and clarity. Surrounded. That's the difference between praying from anxiety and praying from alignment. Now, rounded. Does every prayer need to follow this order? Of course not. Real relationship allows for fluidity. Rounded. Some moments will be pure desperation. Others will be pure awe. Rounded. But having a structure like ACTS gives you a baseline. a rhythm you can return to when your mind feels scattered or your heart feels numb. Surrounded. And here's the deeper point. Structure doesn't make your prayer less authentic. It makes it more intentional. Surrounded. Like scales for a pianist or warm ups for an athlete, the form serves the freedom. Surrounded. You're not praying to perform. You're praying to participate in something far bigger than yourself. Surrounded. So if prayer feels elusive or overwhelming, don't start with eloquence. Start with a framework. Surrounded. Let it hold you while your inner world finds its voice. Here's the idea I want to leave you with. Surrounded. Prayer becomes sustainable not through emotion, but through intention. And intention begins with structure. Rounded. If prayer is a practice of presence, if it begins with knowing who you're speaking to, and if structure helps the conversation flow with clarity and intention, then the next step is this. Rounded. You must make prayer a habit, a rhythm, not just something you believe in or something you do when life presses in. Rounded. But something you integrate into the fabric of your daily existence. Surrounded. This is where most people struggle, not with the idea of prayer, but with the consistency of it. Surrounded, and understandably so. Life moves fast. Our minds are overstimulated. Our schedules are overcrowded. Rounded. And even when we want to pray, we often tell ourselves we don't have the time or the focus or the energy. Rounded. But let's be honest, what we lack isn't time, it's intentionality. Because the truth is, rounded, we make time for what shapes us. And whether we realize it or not, something is always shaping us. Surrounded. So here's the deeper insight. Surrounded. You don't rise to the level of your spiritual aspirations. You fall to the level of your daily practices. Rounded. You can believe in the power of prayer. You can agree with every word in this speech. Surrounded. But if you don't create space for it, it won't take root. Rounded. Belief without practice is like potential without movement. It's dormant. And prayer, like anything transformative, requires consistency, not perfection, but persistence. Now, from a psychological standpoint, rounded, habit formation is all about simplicity and repetition. Surrounded, if you set the bar too high, I'll pray for an hour every morning, you're almost guaranteed to burn out. Surrounded, your brain resists radical disruption to your routine, even when your heart is sincere. So start small. Rounded, give yourself 5 minutes. Find a consistent time and space. Attach it to something you already do. Waking up. Surrounded, having coffee, walking, journaling. The key is not intensity, the key is frequency. Prayer is like water to the soul. Surrounded, it's not how much you drink in one sitting. It's that you keep coming back to the well. Philosophically, surrounded, this touches on something essential about the human condition. We are creatures of rhythm. Surrounded, from the rising and setting of the sun to the inhale and exhale of breath. Rounded, to the cycles of work and rest. We were never meant to live by chaos. We were made for cadence. And prayer, rounded, when practiced regularly, gives structure not just to your schedule, but to your inner world. Rounded, it reorders your priorities. It re-centers your attention. Rounded, it reminds you day after day that you are not in this life alone. Think of it this way. Surrounded, when you establish a habit of prayer, you're not just adding a spiritual activity to your day. Surrounded, you're building a relationship, and relationships grow through time, attention, and presence. Surrounded, you don't expect intimacy with a friend you speak to once a month. Why would it be different with God? Rounded, but let me be clear, this isn't about guilt. Surrounded, it's not about praying because you should. It's about choosing again and again. Surrounded, to orient your life toward what matters most. And if you miss a day or many days, start again. Surrounded. The practice of prayer is as much about returning as it is about beginning. So what does it look like surrounded? Maybe it's waking up and sitting in stillness for 3 minutes rounded, just acknowledging God's presence before the day begins. Surrounded. Maybe it's writing one honest sentence in a journal each night. Maybe it's a breath prayer during your commute. Rounded. Whatever form it takes, make it yours. Let it be simple. Let it be sustainable. And let it be consistent. Rounded because over time, the habit of prayer does something that emotion and inspiration alone cannot do. It forms you. Surrounded, slowly, quietly, deeply. So here's what I want you to reflect on. You don't find time for prayer. Rounded, you make time because who you become depends on it. At this point in the journey, surrounded, you understand what prayer is: a sacred presence, not a performance. Rounded, you've begun to reshape your view of God, not as distant or disinterested, but as deeply personal. Rounded, you've learned that structure isn't a constraint, but a guide. And you've started forming a consistent habit. Surrounded. But even with all that in place, there's one critical element that still needs to be addressed: honesty. Rounded. And I don't mean surface level honesty. I mean emotional transparency, deep, unfiltered, surrounded, sometimes uncomfortable honesty. Because the truth is, surrounded, most people don't struggle to pray because they're unsure how. It's because they're afraid to be fully seen. Surrounded, not just by God, but even by themselves. We are masters of selective vulnerability. Arounded. We edit ourselves around friends, at work, even in private thought. Arounded, we convince ourselves that if we keep certain emotions locked down, anger, fear, surrounded, shame, they'll just go away. But the human psyche doesn't work that way. What we suppress doesn't disappear. Rounded, it festers. And when we carry that avoidance into our prayer life, surrounded, we turn a space meant for liberation into yet another performance. Surrounded, another place where we're trying to say the right thing instead of the true thing. Rounded. But here's the psychological and spiritual paradox. Arounded, transformation doesn't come through control, it comes through confession. Not the ritual kind, necessarily surrounded, but the act of owning what's real within us, even if it's messy, even if it's contradictory. Surrounded, even if it's hard to admit. Prayer is the one place where there is no benefit to pretending. God already knows. Rounded. The only person you're hiding from is you. And yet most people enter prayer with a kind of guardedness. Rounded. We filter our language. We try to sound composed. We stick to safe topics. Rounded. But the history of spiritual writing, and even Scripture itself, is filled with the raw, rounded, unedited voice of the human soul. Job yelling at God. David weeping in despair and dancing in joy. Rounded. Jesus crying out in anguish. Real prayer has always been messy, honest, unfiltered. Not because God needs drama, rounded, but because the soul needs release. Philosophically, this speaks to something deeper than catharsis. Rounded. The existentialist tradition, thinkers like Kierkegaard and Buber, emphasizes that truth must become truth for you. Surrounded, it's not enough to know ideas about God, or even to say the right theological words. Surrounded. What matters is that those truths are spoken from a real place. That prayer becomes not just a conversation with God, surrounded, but a confrontation with your own inner world. And here's the irony: the more honest you are in prayer, surrounded, the more deeply you experience the presence of God, because you're no longer approaching God as a concept, surrounded, or as a theological abstraction. You're encountering God as you actually are, And that's where intimacy is born. Grounded. That's where healing begins. Psychologically, this kind of honesty is also profoundly regulating. Surrounded. Naming what you feel out loud. Grounded in prayer activates parts of the brain that reduce emotional reactivity and increase clarity. Grounded. It's why therapists ask you to say things out loud, because language organizes emotion. Grounded. And when prayer becomes a space where nothing is off limits, no fear too dark, no desire too selfish, grounded, no doubt too threatening, you begin to experience prayer not just as a discipline, but as a refuge. Surrounded. So if you're wondering where to go next in your practice of prayer, surrounded, the answer may not be more time or better technique. It may simply be this: stop editing. Grounded. Bring your full self, your questions, your contradictions, your longings. Grounded. And trust that God would rather hear an honest cry than a polished speech. Surrounded. Here's the truth I want to leave with you. Surrounded. The power of prayer isn't found in getting the words right. It's found in having the courage to be real. By now, surrounded, we've traveled through the essential dimensions of prayer: what it is, who you're speaking to. Surrounded, how to approach it with structure, how to build it into your daily rhythm, and how to show up with radical honesty. Surrounded. But there's one more truth we can't afford to ignore: prayer is learned through practice, not theory. Surrounded, not inspiration, not even conviction, but repetition. It is not mastered in a single moment of clarity. Surrounded, but developed over time through presence, struggle, silence, and return. This might sound obvious. Grounded, but for many people, it's the breaking point. We live in a culture that prizes immediacy. Grounded, we expect emotional reward from spiritual activity. We want prayer to feel good, to make sense. Surrounded, to produce results quickly. But real prayer doesn't operate on demand. It moves at the pace of relationship. Surrounded, it unfolds like a language, and like any language, you become fluent only through immersion, effort. Surrounded, and the willingness to sound clumsy while you learn. From a psychological perspective, this matters deeply. Surrounded, because your mind is constantly looking for efficiency. It wants to automate your behavior. Grounded, if something feels too difficult, uncertain, or unrewarding, the brain tends to classify it as non-essential. Grounded, and that's what happens with prayer when the early attempts feel awkward or fruitless. Surrounded, people give up, not because they're incapable of praying. Grounded, but because they didn't expect it to require formation. The truth is, even silence in prayer is not wasted. Grounded, even the distractions have something to teach you. The wandering mind is part of the process, not a failure of it. Grounded, the philosopher Simone Weil once wrote, "Absolutely unmixed attention is prayer." And in that sense, grounded, prayer is less about words and more about presence. And presence is something you practice one moment at a time. Surrounded, here's a hard but freeing truth: you will not always feel connected when you pray. Surrounded, you won't always sense that God is near. You won't always have clarity. And that's okay. Grounded, the life of prayer is not about chasing spiritual highs. It's about cultivating a long, surrounded, steady trust in the presence of a God who remains even when you don't feel Him. In fact, it is in those dry, surrounded, ordinary, even frustrating moments that something deeper is being formed in you: spiritual resilience. Grounded, this brings us to something philosophers and spiritual teachers alike have echoed for centuries. Grounded, the difference between those who grow in the life of prayer and those who don't is not intelligence, gifting, surrounded, or emotional experience. It's perseverance. It's the willingness to keep showing up. Grounded, to pray when it's easy and when it's excruciating, to trust that even when nothing seems to be happening, surrounded, something is happening beneath the surface. You're being shaped. Your inner world is being reoriented, surrounded. You're learning to live with greater awareness, greater patience, and a deeper capacity to love. Rounded, that's not sentiment, it's formation. Just as physical exercise strengthens the body slowly over time, surrounded, so does consistent prayer strengthen the soul. And the reward is not always immediate, but it is always real, surrounded. So don't let frustration or boredom convince you that prayer isn't working, surrounded. Don't let silence make you believe God isn't listening, rounded. And don't let the slow pace of growth keep you from continuing. Prayer is not a task to conquer, rounded. It's a space to return to again and again. And as with any meaningful discipline, surrounded, you don't wait until you feel ready to begin. You begin, and that is what makes you ready. Surrounded. So here's the final truth I want you to carry with you, rounded. Prayer doesn't become powerful by being perfect. It becomes powerful by being practiced.